Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to discuss tactical ideas in endgames. One of the big misconceptions is that people think that when you reach an endgame, you don't need to worry about tactics. It's all about calculation and fine nuances and the delicate moves. However, I'd like to point it out that at all stages of the chess game, let it be the opening, the middle game, or even the end game, you always have to be alert to tactics in a chess game. Let's get to the first example, which is actually from a real game being played in 2005 in the World Cup. If you look at this position, we can easily tell that it is black who is ahead, since black has a bishop while white has no pieces other than the pawns or the king. As compensation, white has only one pawn, which normally is insufficient to compensate a bishop. Now in this case, white's hope can be the fact that a king and bishop in itself is not sufficient winning material. So that means that if white would successfully exchange black's pawn, the last pawn on the board, on h6, for even two of the pawns, the game would be immediately a guaranteed draw. However, that is easier said than done, especially if at this moment, when it is black's turn, black finds the correct way of playing. I suggest you take a little bit of time, I would say somewhere between up to 5 to 10 minutes, and try to figure out what would you do here if you had the black pieces and were to move. Then come back and compare your solution to the correct one. So in this position, white would like to play next move up the pawn from h2 to h4 and then follow it up with g5. The big question is, what if anything can black do against that, to stop that? Well, here is the beautiful solution to win the game. Black has to play the only way to win, bishop to g5. Of course, white can play h4 here as well. In fact, white did play that in the game. Now, not only moving the pawn up to h4, but attacking black's bishop. And here comes the key to the solution. It is that the bishop does not need to move away, in which case white would be ready to push the g-pawn and exchange the last pawn. But the winning move is to move the king to f4, making sure the bishop on g5 will be protected a second time. And then when pawn captures bishop, pawn captures back, and very important, it is white's turn right now, and white is in a so-called Zugzwang, which means that white wishes they wouldn't have to make a move. They could say, I pass, but as we know, that's not allowed in chess, and therefore, after the white king moves, white's last pawn on g4 is lost, and then all black needs to do is move the king out of his own g5 pawn's way, and then push the pawn up and promote it to a queen. And there's nothing that white could do to stop that. Okay, let's move on to a different example, but still in an endgame. The position we see in front of us right now, we have a queen and rook endgame with white's two extra pawns. And in fact, white is about to capture a third one on h6. That would be pretty much the end of the game. Fortunately for black, it was their turn, and they have just one moment to do something. Again, I'd advise you to try to spend a little bit of time on your own. Hopefully, a couple of minutes will be sufficient, or again, up to 5-10 minutes, and come up with the correct idea. What should black do here? Well, it's not that difficult to notice that if black would make the natural looking move with the rook from f7 to g7 to pin the white queen, that would be actually suicidal, because the white rook would come up to e8 and voila, game over, checkmate. Okay, so that's out of question. The question is, what else can black do? Another natural try would be to give a check with the queen on d4. The problem is that black will run out of checks real quick after the white king moves back to h3. In this position, you really need to use your creativity to come to the correct solution. An important element to notice is that the black king at the moment has no legal moves. And what does that invite? Well, that invites the thought of a possible stalemate, especially with only so few pieces left on the board. Of course, the pawn on h6 cannot move either, so it's only up to the black queen and rook. And as we know, those are very powerful and long-range pieces, and therefore there may be an opportunity to create a stalemate. Okay, so the question is how to get started with it. The point is, black would like to get rid of both the rook as well as the queen. But black needs to be very careful in which order he would do it. The only correct way to achieve the goal, that is to get rid of the queen and the rook and achieve stalemate, is to first give up the rook. Generally, in such situations, the rule of thumb is that we would want to get rid of the lesser value piece, and then the higher value, in this case the queen. Now white has two options, either to capture the rook or to move out of the check. If indeed the pawn would capture the rook, then the solution is rather simple. Queen f4. If king captures the queen, we immediately achieve the goal, stalemate. Or if the king moves out of the check, then after queen check on h2, again it will be a forced stalemate if king takes queen immediately. Or after king g4, black has numerous choices to achieve it. For example, queen g3, and now white no longer has a choice, must capture the queen, and it's a beautiful stalemate. Remember, this is not a composition, this is actually from a real game, and it's not unusual to see stalemates in real game. In fact, among club players or beginner players, it is the most common way when a game ends in a draw. So right now, after rook f4, a bit more challenging for black would be if white moves out of the check as he did in the game. And here it's a wonderful opportunity for black to go wrong. Again, if black would make the mistake to give up the queen first instead of the rook, that would give up on the chance to save the game. For example, after queen h2, king takes, rook check, king g2, rook h2. See, black is trying desperately to get rid of all his mobile pieces, and after king f1, rook f2, king e1, rook e2, king d1, rook d2, king c1. And when rook c2 comes, that's a very important pattern. White succeeds to stop the checks and move the queen away, and with that open up a whole bunch of squares for the black king to move to, and therefore the position is no longer stalemate. A very important pattern, because just because the opponent is trying to get rid of his or her last piece to achieve stalemate, it doesn't necessarily mean that it always works. Just like in this case, white is completely winning. Going back to this position, the correct move right now is following the rule of thumb of giving up the lesser valued piece of the two, the rook, first. And only after that's gone, the rook is gone, then we are ready to give up the queen as well and achieve the stalemate we already talked about. A very nice example. Let's move on to our next example, in which case we have a queen and knight versus queen and bishop endgame. Let's see what's going on right now. It is white's turn, and black has some serious threats, namely to capture the pawn on f2 with a check moreover, and then when the white king would move to the corner, checkmate would follow with bishop e4. What to do for white? Not so simple, because even if in this position white would try to capture black's bishop on f5, the problem is that black would not recapture, in which case white would be winning, but would at least force a draw by giving perpetual checks. So let's go back and think again, what other option may we have? Retreating the queen to b2 to protect the pawn on f2 is out of question, because the knight on e7 would be lost immediately. So if we cannot come back and defend the pawn, we cannot capture the bishop on f5. Pushing the f pawn doesn't help, because the checks will continue anyway with queen f2 or queen h3. What may it be that still achieves the goal? Quite impressively, white's passed pawn on the d-file becomes the hero. Of course, not by pushing it right away, because in that case black would checkmate real quick after queen f2. Here a beautiful combination starts with knight capturing on g6. Look at that. White is using the opportunity the moment that the black pieces are positioned unfortunately. First of all, there is a pin over the f-pawn, therefore the pawn cannot capture. If the king would move, white would checkmate right away on the following move. And finally, if the bishop captures the knight, which is the most natural move, then white will make a quiet move, simply advancing the d5 pawn to d6. Now that the pawn on f2 is safe and protected, white had the time for a quiet move. Well, actually it is not quite that quiet. While it looks quiet, reality is it immediately prepares a checkmate threat of queen h8. And as black does not have any aggressive moves, black needs to deal with the checkmate threat. Unfortunately for black, the king cannot run towards the other side of the board, because then the checkmate would come on e7. And if the king goes to g8, as black did in the game, then already the d-pawn all of a sudden ran away and cannot be stopped from getting promoted. A very nice little combination by the Russian Grandmaster Yusupov. A very nice combination by the Russian-born Grandmaster Yusupov. Let's move on to our next example, when again we are having queens and knight, although this time queen against queen and knight, not queen bishop. In this position, again it is white's turn. We have even number of pawns, plus a queen each, a knight each. So it looks like things are pretty even. However, it's quite visible that the black king is a bit more vulnerable open to attack. Also, white has a pawn on the d file which is a bit more advanced than either of the black pawns. With all that said, if it would be black's turn, the fight would be still very open and the most likely result of the game would be a draw. So the question is, how can white take advantage of the fact that it is their turn right now? So in this position, white needs to make forceful moves in order not to allow black to recuperate and to save the game. White can give several checks with a knight or with a queen, but there is only one that achieves the goal, which is to either win material. But there is only one check which achieves the goal, which is to win material right away by force. The correct check of them is to move the queen back to h2. Even though the black king has 3 possible responses right now, none of them really help. Moving to either of the light squares would immediately put the king into a forking problem. Also, moving the king to g6 would result in the fork with knight to e5. So the only reasonable move is to move to g7, but sadly for black, this does not help either, because the white queen arrives on h6, forcing black to move down to g8, and now a move which is almost a checkmate, knight f6, forces black to give up the queen for the knight, which obviously will result in a tremendous material gain for white. And let's move on to the next example. Here we are. This is a position where it seems that again white is extremely close to a draw. We have even material and a rook and bishop endgame. Well, let's think about the situation here. What's going on? Again, if it would be white's turn, white would be doing not too bad at all. But it is black's turn. The question is, what should black do on the queen side, where there is a little situation going on with the white pawn on b3 and the black pawn on c4. There is an invitation to trade pawns on b3, or possibly to advance the pawn to c3 and gain a tempo by attacking white's rook. Try to think for a little bit and see what conclusion will you come to without listening right away to the correct solution. Well, hopefully you found the correct sequence in this position, and that is not to trade the pawn on b3, which is certainly playable, but would miss out on an excellent opportunity to immediately get material gain. So, let's talk about advancing the pawn to c3. What's going on right now? The white rook is hanging, that's obvious. Another important thing to notice is the fact that the black bishop is on f5, aiming at the pawn to c2. So, therefore, if the white rook would move somewhere along the d file, then the pawn on c2 would immediately be lost. But, wait a minute, what if the rook will move to e2? Why? To keep protecting the pawn on c2. Well, this is very logical so far. Now, I'd like to point one thing that's rather important, and that is that the pawn on c3 may become very powerful and a potential queen, but also if white would get sufficient time, that very same pawn could also become a target of attack and a weakness. So if white right now would get the time to get his own king to d4 to attack the pawn, and then either attack it a second time or, for example, reposition the bishop and get the bishop to d5 and then to c4, while the king is on d4. So those are white's threats. So if black wouldn't have the excellent move that they do have at their disposal at the moment, strategically speaking, pushing the pawn to c3 actually is a very risky endeavor. Because that pawn, as I said, as it's isolated, it can or could become a weakness as well. However, because that very pawn is so far advanced, black has an important and efficient tactical opportunity at his disposal. And the brilliant move is moving the bishop to d3. Very pretty move. The bishop cannot be well captured because then the c-pawn advances and white will be forced to give up the rook for the pawn. On the other hand, the rook is under attack, and if it moves, then the pawn on c2 will be lost and black's advantage will be obvious. A very nice example. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. Wow, look at this position. It seems like it's about time for white to resign. Black still has the queen, and moreover, black is about to give a checkmate with queen a2. As usual, I suggest you take a few minutes, at least, and try to figure out what would you do, how would you resolve this situation, in where not only that white can save the game, white can win the game. So try to think, how can that happen? To give you a hint, typically in such situations with so much material disadvantage, generally things have to continue with forceful moves. Usually there is no time for quiet moves, especially not when the opponent is about to checkmate us with queen a2. The brilliant first move is to simply advance the d-pawn, and if the queen captures it, then another unexpected and brilliant move. Pawn promotes, under promotes to a knight. Very beautiful, and arrives immediately with a checkmate. A very pretty example. It's also important to point out that if the black king would either capture the pawn or move to d7, in either of those cases the knight will move to f6 with a fork, winning the black queen, and once the black queen is gone, then already the b-pawn will promote, but of course not to a knight, but to a queen, giving white an easy win. What a beautiful composition by Sonntag. I hope you enjoyed these colorful examples of tactics in endgames, and as you can see, it's not unusual, even in practical games, that tactics are around in endgames. Except for the last example, the jewel of the week, in all other endgames that we saw in this lesson, they were all played in real games. Well, I hope I gave you some ideas for endgames and even the alertness that you know that you need to look for tactics, and by the way, not just your own, but as well your opponent's as well, to make sure you avoid falling into your opponent's trap. So the point is, whether doesn't matter what stage of the game you're at, you need to be alert to tactics all the time, at your own opportunities as well as your opponent's potential traps. Thank you for listening, and so long until next time. Bye-bye.